For those who want to get a backstory, you can go check out part one, get more information about how Nick got started, how he became politicized, and how he got involved in many of these movements. But right now, we're actually going to talk about two books that you released last year. Mm-hmm. Before we do that, this is a Dawes Center for the Arts signature series, speaker series, joined today by Nick Estes. We're very, very excited for that. The DAW is a not-for-profit based in Pomona, California, serving Pomona, the surrounding areas. And now that the world's on the internet, we service the world. So really, really excited to have you, Nick. So Nick, can you tell us a little bit about your first one came out, which was the first book you released out of last year, Our History is the Future?
Sure, yeah. So there's two books. There's Our History is the Future, which was published by Verso last March. And then there is Standing with Standing Rock, which is an edited volume that I co-edited with Jess, and Dylan from the New School. And that has 30 contributors. But the first volume, Our History is the Future, is not necessarily just a kind of like recap of what happened at the uprising at Standing Rock, but it really goes into the longer history of Oceti Shawkomi traditions of resistance, what I call the long tradition of Indigenous resistance. And what I mean by that is thinking about not just Standing Rock as sort of a movement within a moment, right, or a moment within a movement, or thinking about it as a moment within a larger kind of movement of history. Because one of the things I noticed as being a participant in the Standing Rock movement, but then also being part of kind of the initial protests against the Keystone XL pipeline, is that there wasn't a lot of kind of historical context about what was going on. There was a lot of people who were coming to Standing Rock for the very first time, coming to Oceti Shawkomi or Lakota and Dakota speaking kind of nations for the first time without really any strong kind of like sense of history. And so what I did with that book is like actually grounded it within a long kind of historical and intellectual tradition. And so instead of just relying on a lot of the kind of non-native, non-Lakota, non-Dakota scholars, I really tapped into Oceti Shawkomi intellectual traditions. And primarily, we have, like, as the Oceti Shawkomi, we have a Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota speaking writing society, of which I'm a part of. And so when we have, so for example, there's an author out there right now, Pekka Hämäläinen. He's a Finnish historian who wrote a book called Comanche Empire. He wrote a new book called Lakota America, which is a really bizarre name. But there's this kind of assumption, especially from like the Western historical canon, that Indigenous peoples like don't write their own history, when in fact, of all the sort of like Indigenous nations within North America, the Oceti Shawkomi, or as we're kind of colloquially and derogatorily called the Sioux, are perhaps the most written about and discussed Indigenous nation. But what's also not really talked about is the fact that just based on our own intellectual traditions, we've written over 200 history, or 200 books, and that includes like fiction and nonfiction and history. And so like the first kind of like comprehensive Lakota history that was ever written was by somebody like Luther Standing Bear back in the 1930s. And he was, a Si-Chongu, or from the Rosebud Sioux tribe. He was actually the first student to actually enter Carlisle Indian School in 1870. I think he was sent in 1879. So the Lakota people were part of the very first kind of like wave of that boarding school era, the off-reservation kind of militarized industrial school era. And those schools were not meant to like teach us anything, right? Most of the students that went there never graduated. And in fact, many of them died there. So that first class, half of them died, hundreds of Lakota children. And the reason why they did that, and the reason why we became kind of illiterate people, is through genocide, very ironically, or not so ironically, kind of tragically. But thinking about his story and the fact that he learned to read and write from this kind of genocidal experiment called Carlisle Industrial Indian School, that was actually created by an army officer from who was a Civil War veteran, but then became a kind of an infamous Indian fighter who actually was under the command for a while of Colonel Armstrong Custer, who was killed by us, massacred by us, and then later achieved the rank of general. But Colonel Pratt was actually the one who kind of like created this, and it was never meant to educate us. In fact, they stole our children to actually force us to cede land. And so he came out of that generation. He was actually born, he was kind of like the last generation born free, so to speak. Grew up in a Buffalo High teepee, grew up only speaking his language, the Lakota language, but in fact became literate. And in many of that particular era, actually were literate in both English and Lakota because of the churches. And the churches, played this assimilation role, but also they played this role in kind of like making our language a written language. And so to say for somebody to like Pekka Haimalainen, this Finnish dude who wrote this book Lakota America, to have the arrogance to say that this is the first comprehensive history of the Lakota people is actually participating in that kind of indigenous eliminatory process of settler colonialism, right? To say that we actually need Finnish historians to come in and write our own history. And the fact of the matter is he doesn't speak Lakota. He doesn't know the Lakota traditions. So why is it that like somebody who, if I was a Russian historian, you would probably think, hey, like, how are you going to like visit, Russian archives if you don't even speak Russian, but this is the standard. This is the level of standard of US history. And so I was really writing against that. And I was very much part of this kind of longer intellectual tradition that I talked a little bit about in the last kind of interview that we did. And that interview, I spelled out a little bit about like Vine Deloria, a junior talking, writing Custer Died for Your Sins. But more importantly, I think I've been influenced by Elizabeth Cooklin, who's a literary scholar. She's Dakota. She actually grew up on a reservation about 20 minutes away from where I was born and raised. But she and I have like a shared history in the sense that, we are river people. Our people grew up on the river. And then also, we wrote this kind of like, these histories of the river. And so I grew up listening to these stories from my grandfather, from my father, and they were really just histories that I learned, just from coffee table conversations. That was kind of like my peer review process growing up as a young person, is to like actually get those stories straight. And when I actually wrote this book, I was sitting, I was like, it was after kind of the tail end of the Standing Rock protests, and these camps had been evicted, and people were kind of like figuring out what do we do next. And I actually went and like holed up at my aunt's house, who lives on the Missouri River, like slept on her couch for 4 weeks, and literally just woke up every single day. I'd go for a run. I didn't shave a lot. It was really nasty. It was like,
you were quarantining before it was cool.
Yeah, I was quarantining before it was cool. And literally what I did was I just took out a yellow legal pad, and I would just write the stories that I remember listening to. And then, those were kind of based on the oral like histories that I grew up listening to. And then I would go and kind of like cross-check them with the so-called like official records. And so that's the process. And I actually still have that stack of papers of like kind of the original, or the first draft, I should say, writing out. And my hand really hurt, but that's the way like I wrote that book. And it was, it's based off these interviews that I did with, some of the leadership within the Standing Rock movement. There was a lot of emphasis on a lot of the environmental NGOs, and they did provide like a very like comprehensive like media narrative of what was going on the ground in Standing Rock. But one thing that I felt was missing, and I think a lot of these leaders from these NGOs would agree with me, is that there was this like really kind of grassroots element to the protests. Like I remember arriving for the first time, at the prayer camps, and there were literally just Lakota and indigenous families just showing up in their car with like just basketball shorts and t-shirts, and they were like ready to throw down. That's all they had, and that's what actually makes movements. That's what makes it's not just like these kind of people who are sitting in front of CNN cameras and talking. It's actually like everyday people, and that's what made this like a real kind of social movement. And the fact that like it admits that there was these confrontations with the police, there was these kind of spectacles of protests, people were shutting down equipment and chaining down to it, and this direct action aspect got a lot of media coverage, like as it should, because it's a tactic, right? But one thing that always happens that I think doesn't get, and I think it's kind of like this, it's kind of the same issues that we faced with the Red Power movement, is that you kind of had the braid and shade like masculine kind of front facing media spectacle, right? And behind the scenes, a lot of that so-called like gender division of labor, where a lot of the women were really doing kind of the institutional building and like the caretaking work. And you saw a lot of that, at the camps, there was a language school, a language revitalization school, because at the time it was the 10th largest like city in North Dakota, because it had that large of a population. And so you had all these children. So what are you going to do with the children? You know, you have to have classes, and they attempted to incorporate, but it didn't really work out that way. But nonetheless, they were getting this kind of like grassroots education. And my friend Marcella Gilbert, who's actually in the book, you know, she herself was a product of the survival schools, the American Indian Movement survival schools that were created in the 1970s to, first of all, deal with all the children whose parents were being, you know, locked up by the feds and being, you know, being put on trial by the U.S. government for the Wounded Knee occupation and other occupations that were going on. And there was all these, you know, she tells a story about like how her mother, Madonna Thunderhawk, was sitting around, and there was all these children, and they were like, you know, who's your parents? And they're like, oh, this person, they're in trial, they're in jail. And so they created a school out of it called Survival School. And you see this like across revolutionary movements, you know, with the Sandinistas, with, you know, even with MST today, right? The Popular Education Projects. And so this was a very kind of revolutionary moment. And so you see those kind of like historical reiterations of, you know, radical land-based pedagogy in places, you know, north of the Medicine Line in so-called Canada. You have a lot of these kind of land-based projects going on, like in Wet'suwet'en territory. You have the Healing Center that's run by Frida Huson and Dr. Carla Tate, that tries to reconnect, you know, Indigenous individuals back to kind of the land in a way that helps them deal with things such as addiction and trauma. Colonial trauma. And so this was like a very, you know, if we look at Standing Rock was like a very kind of like intensified version of those kind of political and cultural projects, right? And so that was really what I was trying to capture in this book. But there's also this kind of longer internationalist history that relates to things such as our treaties. Our treaties aren't just like, you know, these kind of broken documents that, you know, are sitting in the dustbin of history, but in fact, they're very alive in how we talk about our grievances against the United States government, but also how we understand what we mean by terms such as Lakol Wichon, which means the Lakota way of being, or Wo Lakota, which is actually like a more kind of contemporarized terminology that now means treaty, but in the past it was like, how do we, you know, come back into correct relations? And so I trace these kind of Lakota understandings of treaties, and how, you know, it's not this kind of like ahistorical, mystical, like, oh, we're just plugging our braids into trees, like on, you know, Avatar in the Na'vi or whatever. But there's actually like this knowledge base about our relationship, not just with the human world, but with the non-human world. And so when we created these treaties, we had provisions for like the Buffalo Nation that said, so long as the buffalo shall roam, to justify the chase. And that, you know, that set aside about a 35 million acre of territory just for our buffalo relatives, right? For us to be Lakota, we need that relationship. And so that treaty is not just with the U.S. government or a white supremacist empire, right? It's actually with these non-human relations. And most people don't know this about treaties, is that each party has equal weight of interpretation, and we've given over and we've ceded a monopoly of interpretation to the colonizers, right? So it doesn't mean that these treaties are invalid, and in fact, you know, many people, like, you know, even non-Indigenous people can uphold them. And that was kind of the gist of the book, is to really kind of give this background information, but also to present the information in a way that's accessible. And so I wrote it for like my 17-year-old self, when I was like really becoming politicized, when the United States had invaded Iraq for the second time, but then also, you know, had begun the so-called war on terror with the invasion of Afghanistan. And I had, you know, in our previous conversation, I had attended you know, an anti-war protest, had no idea that it was part of this kind of larger historical anti-war movement. But I had nothing to connect, like no book to really connect with what I was doing. And so actually, there was, you know, a nephew of mine who's actually in the same high school that I went to school in, and I gave him both of these books. You know, I was like, here, like, take this and read this, and I hope this helps you, you know, kind of figure out your path, because there was just nothing for me when I was that age, and that's why I wrote the book.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there, but it's just very interesting to me how people don't realize the totality of what the American system really is. I mean, and like, because I mean, there's kind of this false binary between these two major political parties, but like you see, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's like this kind of like celebrated hero. I mean, she cited the Doctrine of Discovery not that long ago, and when you have a Supreme Court justice citing the someone in that position saying this is law because of the Doctrine of Discovery, it's almost like when you like renew a library book or something. Like it's like what I mean? It's a very powerful position she's in to be doing that, right? So, yeah. And then I was, thinking about like, I mean, all you mentioned, you Custer and this, and I mean, like, I don't know, like, I think people think that like, the party of Andrew Jackson is somehow going to save them. And I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, but what's fascinating about it too is that like I point this out if you look at the Supreme Court, or not the Supreme Court, the federal court case where Justice Erbaum was attempting to adjudicate on whether or not the treaty that the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty that we had signed with the United States government was considered, an international agreement. Mm-hmm. We actually won that case in saying that it was in fact an international agreement and that the federal government and the federal court system has no place and no business interpreting what is otherwise known, as international law. And like in what I argue in that particular chapter, I think it's the chapter on internationalism, but thinking about the U.S. Federal Indian law canon, it's actually a conservative canon. I don't mean like liberal and conservative. I mean in the sense that it actually operates on things such as the doctrine of discovery, which propagates the belief, the idea that indigenous people are only 2/3 human, right? We possess a body and we possess rationality, but we don't possess a soul, right? And that was the debate between like, what was his name? The guy from, gosh, I can't remember his name now off the top of my head. De las Casas, right? Mm. And I can't remember, Vittoria, I think is his name, but they were debating on whether or not indigenous people have souls and whether or not they're human beings, right? And so that's, like it became, like, yeah, we possessed, the body, we possessed rationality, we were 2/3 human. So if you killed us, you at least had to convert us to Christianity before you did so. So that became kind of like this, and that draws back from, the Papal Bulls of the Doctrine of Discovery, which was essentially dividing up the world between for the Portuguese and the Spanish, crowns. And the Portuguese, got this part of the world, and the Spanish got the other part of the world. And what's also not often talked about is the fact that this actually this was the moral and kind of divine justification for African slavery as well, because it was a practice, but it hadn't quite picked up at the time, right? But it later became a justification to say that, well, African people are not actually full human beings, so therefore they can be enslaved as well. So when we talk about the conservative nature of federal Indian law, that's the foundation, is the idea that indigenous people aren't fully human. So there's this kind of weird back and forth when you say like, oh, indigenous nations, because we're not actually recognized as full indigenous nations with sovereignty by the federal government. It's always kind of like we were, because of our proximity to nature and because of our proximity to, savagery, we'll always be viewed by children. And that's actually our position right now within the federal system. You have the Department of Interior. What does the Department of Interior manage? It manages wildlife and natural resources. We are literally in the same department as animals, right? We're the only so like when people think about this, like this still exists. This is still the system. But who controls the Department of Interior? Who are the appointees? Most of them are oil and gas people. Burkhart is an oil and gas lobbyist. He's the current secretary. The previous one was, he himself was an oil and gas lobbyist. Tara Sweeney was the second Indigenous woman to be appointed to the Secretary of Indian Affairs in that position. She herself, was the vice president of one of the wealthiest Alaskan oil companies, which raked in about, I think, $12 billion according to its last portfolio. So these are the people who are in charge of indigenous people. We don't elect them. They're appointed often by the presidency. So if you want to talk about authoritarianism, right, but also to talk about how indigenous people are still considered, we're still considered wards of the state. That's our legal status. We can no longer hold our property in common, right? That was part of the assimilation process. We can be private property owners, but we can't, as a nation. It's always works to our detriment to hold property in common. So if you look back at the early debates between, these Indian reformers who were either military people or just like do-gooder liberals like RG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RBG. It doesn't matter what political spectrum you fall on. The fact of the matter is that they all were, moving towards assimilating us
Mhm.
at some point in time, and that actually meant privatizing our land base. And so if you look at settler societies, their organizing principle is the elimination of the indigenous person or the indigenous nations, because we, represent a kind of counter sovereignty to the United States. And so our nationhood is contingent upon the parameters set by the federal government. And we saw that at Standing Rock. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe doesn't have, a final authority of whether or not its waterways will be contaminated by an oil and gas pipeline. So these are the things that we confront, to this day.
Yeah. So many U.S. left historians and so much of U.S. Marxism hinges on this question of the Civil War as being this
Mm-hmm.
kind of like point of revolutionary kind of thing. Even though it's bourgeois, it's still like an advance, beyond this kind of et cetera, et cetera. And they have all kinds of rationalizations as to why certain things were. And they hold up the figure of Abraham Lincoln as having advanced history for this and this point. But it's always been my viewpoint, and I'm of Mexican descent. I'm Chicano, and that the whole westward expansion, the manifest destiny, that moving westward, wasn't just something that the slaveholders wanted. I mean, the free soilers were equally invested in grabbing that land. I mean, for whatever they wanted to use it for, and it's almost kind of to the people that would be slaughtered and killed in the aftermath. That's almost kind of irrelevant, like as to well, we want to do this with it, versus we want to do that with it. So, I mean, can you speak a little bit to that? I mean, to because I know we talked last time about Marxism, but I mean, like, there's some stuff that needs to be corrected there, because it's not just like, okay, this is great because it's an advance on that. No, it's still like slaughtering people and killing people.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, because it's something that I'm thinking through now, because Marx and Engels really celebrated a lot of the, I think they even I can't remember the name of it, but it was this it was like the first kind of like working man's association that arose out of the industrial North. Might have been in Philadelphia, of all places. I don't know the exact date, but they were like, this is the socialist movement in the United States, and like this is the first kind of like socialist organization to exist. But if you look back at the socialist organization, they were like, many of them were racist against, they viewed African slaves as like subservient, or even just freed Africans as subservient to the kind of white race. And they saw them as competition as far as like wage labor jobs, right? But then also they advocated for the extermination of indigenous people in the West. And so like, I think the failure of, I would say not just Marxism, but I think it's a kind of U.S. exceptionalism, right, of Marxism that has portrayed itself that has grown out of the U.S. because it's adopted the settler mentality. Go to Palestine and ask Palestinian Marxists, about Israeli settlers, right, and Marxism. Like it's a more like intensified kind of like conflict in the sense of settler colonialism, because it's very much like still an armed struggle. And like ask them their opinions of Israeli Marxists or settler Marxists who exist there. And people like say, oh, like that's a derogatory term. But if you're still advocating for the dispossession or requiring the dispossession of indigenous people, or even Africans who are here on this continent, like that is not decolonial. And so, like I think somebody like W.E.B. Du Bois really challenged this in Black Reconstruction. Obviously, he was more concerned about kind of centering the idea of a Black worker, right, and a Black proletariat. And he did a really beautiful job on this. And to this day, most historians don't engage this work. They see it as revisionist. But he was making the case that the Revolutionary War, or excuse me, that the Civil War was a revolutionary war, and that there was a general strike on behalf of the formerly enslaved escaping and joining the Union Army. And he kind of hints at this free soil movement, but doesn't really get into it. And I think the works such as Walter Johnson's got a new book called The Broken Heart of America, I think it's called. What is it? Yeah, this one sitting on my desk. He talks a lot about how you can't talk about African slavery or the plantation system without talking about settler colonialism. And I think we have to talk about that internal kind of class racism against, especially indigenous people. And actually, class warfare and class struggle begins at the moment that European invaders come here. It doesn't begin when some people in a factory, some white settlers in a factory decide that they're going to form an organization, right? Like that's not our traditions. And you can look even at like Latin American Marxists, and they talk about this a lot. The U.S. is so propagandized, though. Like even within the left movements, they buy into this false narrative of a settler kind of, we have to maintain the integrity of the United States and the settler nation and blah 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 blah. That's absurd. Like that's not winning over anybody who's colonized, right? Who's not an American citizen by choice, right? But also it forgets that the United States, like even if you look at Lenin. And you read like somebody like Lenin next to Frederick Jackson Turner, and this is an amazing book. But it's one of my good friends and colleagues, Manu Karuka, wrote a really good book called Empire's Tracks. It's somewhere on my bookshelf. I'd grab it, but I might knock a bunch of things down. But he did this reading of Lenin and Frederick Jackson Turner because Lenin, in the book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he talks about the advance of the railway system and like how monopoly capital and all of these things. But when he looks at the United States, he takes the United States like in the late 19th century and the latter half of the 19th century as a complete whole. And I was like, we weren't even a part of the U.S. at this time that he was writing. But that's the perception, is that people, like if you ask people to draw the United States in 1776, most people don't know that it was just this small little tiny colony that was hugging the East Coast, right? And that all of these territorial annexations, yes, they are settler colonial, but more importantly, they're imperialist. When you annex territory, that's called imperialism. So imperialism actually begins with westward expansion. And even if you think about the idea of the Monroe Doctrine came before the idea of manifest destiny, right? Manifest destiny was about the consolidation of the frontier. The Monroe Doctrine was an expansionist doctrine, right? That included the kind of foreign domination or the external domination of especially like Latin America, as well as westward expansion. So if you think about American ideology, settler kind of imperialist ideology, that makes a lot of sense, right? It doesn't make sense to say that like the American Indians were the first Americans. Is like, no, we weren't. We were like over 370 different nations. So our like political diversity, far exceeds our political diversity. Our history far exceeds anything that could be called the U.S. And so when you talk about like Marxism is a very I think relevant framework for talking about settler colonialism. But he was, Marx, and we talked about this I think last time, but Marx is writing from the vantage point of Manchester, right? But behind Manchester was a plantation in Mississippi, right? And behind that plantation in Mississippi was indigenous land, right? So you can't talk about the birth of, modern industrial capitalism, the steam engine, the fossil economy, without talking about the kind of imperialist expansion of the United States and indigenous people. So we're not trying to take a framework that was developed and worked in a place like Europe or Russia, or even in Asia or in Africa. Those frameworks work for those kinds of revolutions, but the fact of the matter is you can see like why there's never been a kind of like fomentation of a true kind of like left like revolutionary proletariat in the United States, because it's primarily geared towards privileging settler identity. And like everyone's like, well, that's identity politics, and it's like, well, then forego being a settler, because you have laws that actively work against the dispossession of indigenous people. You take our water, you take our resources. Your entire life, not as an individual, but as a society, is structured on our dispossession. Let's reverse all that. Let's not be identitarian then. And most people will be very uncomfortable with that conversation, right? But I think it's a disservice to having any kind of political education if you're lying to people to say that you're going to still benefit from stolen indigenous land. But it also assumes that people can't hold, they're so stupid that they can't hold the fact that like indigenous genocide, westward expansion, and settler colonialism are bad things that we should be working against, right? I think most people, if they found out the true history of this country, would be like, yeah, like this is messed up. Like, how do we like reverse all of this? You know, like the United States was the first country born entirely as a capitalist state, right? We have to remember that, like, this wasn't like, I think like a lot of European Marxist traditions like see the United States as like, you know, the Declaration of Independence as like a forward kind of bourgeois revolution. But we know from, you know, thinking about this that this was like this required genocide, right? There's nothing progressive about this. It didn't advance this, like our nations at all. It actually destroyed our nations. There's nothing recoverable about that. It literally calls us merciless Indian savages and calls, you know, slave revolts domestic insurrection. To my mind, the Declaration of Independence is a counterinsurgency strategy against indigenous and black folks. That's the way we should be reading it. So like I implore a lot of, you know, leftists or people who are interested in Marx not to read the U.S. canon, because it's completely it's invested in settler, you know, a continued settler occupation and colonization of our homelands. But in fact, we need to actually read and begin to study like indigenous struggles for liberation. And a lot of them, you know, to be frank, are anti-Marxist because they encounter these chauvinistic attitudes from Marxists. There's like, we have this program of what we're going to do with your land when we win the revolution. It's like, how is that like applicable? How's that a materialist like view of reality? You should like, you know, we're a minority of a minority in many ways, but at the same time, we have, if you think about like, if you read Vine Deloria Jr., everybody should read Vine Deloria Jr. Read We Talk, You Listen. He makes this really beautiful point. He said there's three groups of people in this nation who were made citizens as whole groups and thus have a kind of collective consciousness as groups. The first was Africans, that when they became citizens, right, when they fought for their freedom, and you know, citizenship in many ways was a way to co-opt that kind of freedom struggle. And then also the annexation of the northern part of Mexico. It made Mexican Americans, you know, U.S. citizens. But then also in 1924, with the Indian Citizenship Act, it made indigenous people citizens. Those are the only three groups that were made citizens as groups of people, and we have that collective consciousness, right? And so he implores us, you know, back in 1970, to actually begin thinking and developing freedom struggles based on what he called the Peoplehood Framework.
Yeah.
So yeah, like that's a long answer to your question, but
No,
that's where
yeah.
our interrogation of like a materialist conception, especially like revolutionary nationalism, should begin with.
Yeah. I remember actually I was in England giving, you know, doing some talks and stuff, and there was this Spanish communist, like, and this is, I don't really know many Spanish people like from Spain, right? And like he started telling me that the Spanish conquest was a inter-imperialist war. These conquistadors were like working class people, and I shouldn't be so. I almost threw him down a fucking flight of stairs. I swear to God, I never. I don't know if I've ever experienced that level of like rage. I just couldn't believe it. I could not believe it. I couldn't believe he was saying it, and he's like, you know, yeah, he almost like pat me on the head or pinch my cheek or some shit. Like I couldn't believe it. Um, they're outrageous. They're outrageous.
I think like just for people out there who are interested in this, read Capital Volume 1 backwards, because he begins with like colonialism and like, you know, primitive accumulation to talk about like all the destruction that's required of the rest of the world just to have, you know, industrial capitalism in, you know, in Manchester, England, right? So like if you read, I mean, you can follow his line of thinking where he begins with the commodity. You know, it's kind of boring. It's not a very, you know, it's a dry text, but if you begin with the end, it's like wow, he's talking about like gold mining in the Americas, and you know, like Galeano really picks up on that in his book The Open Veins of Latin America, but then also the Trilogy of Fire. Like beautiful stuff. I mean, beautiful and tragic in many ways.
Yeah, yeah, that's great stuff. So we have 5 minutes left. Can you tell us about I'm kind of curious about like when you're talking about gathering some of the text together. You talk about visiting the original sources. Now, were all those original sources the literature previously written by Lakota, or that was that also include like like government, like just censuses and stuff like that?
Yeah, I did a lot of archival research and some oral history research as well. So I had been writing about the damming of our river for almost a decade. Nobody really cared, but because of this, the issue of the water came up with the Dakota Access Pipeline. It really became pertinent to do that kind of history. And I've been doing, I taught like an entire course on it all summer long for at the community college level. I talked to elders. I did interviews with them, and trying to create a community archive, right? Just because there's a lot of there's a lot of history out there that isn't really recognized, and especially like the oral tradition, and that's what I was really trying to focus on. But in fact, the second book, Standing with Standing Rock, is actually more of the archive that I use. It's kind of like some of the interviews that I conducted, I transcribed and put them in to that book. And I suggest people read that because it's more so like my book. I didn't want to be like the first. I mean, it was kind of the first book on Standing Rock. There was another one that preceded it by a Turkish author, um, but I think it was with Zed Books. I think it was just called Standing Rock. And then mine came out, and I don't want to be like the only voice. I don't want to be like that was never my intention. So what I did is I tapped into our writer society, the Oak Lake Writers Society, and I put out a call for papers. And Jess Dillon, who had worked a lot on youth movements, and especially like the youth organizers. And so we just kind of compiled a collection. I think there was like 30 contributors. It's huge. There's like 420 pages of the book. That wasn't an Easter egg on our part, but but no, there's 420 pages of the book, but there's also 30 different stories, and
Yeah.
so it's to represent like that. All these perspectives. You have Kanaka Maoli, people from Hawaii, who are writing about it. You have folks from Navajo Nation who are writing about it, who participated in it. So there's kind of a diversity of perspectives and views. And that book, Standing with Standing Rock, we're really trying to capture that. And also we have, the formal government. Dave Archambault has a piece in there, who's the chairman at the time, as well as, one of the grassroots, two of the grassroots leaders, actually three of the grassroots leaders, two of whom are women, and one is a kind of traditional leadership within our nation. But that was really what we were trying to capture with that, and also the kind of it kind of gives you a glimpse of the rich amount of material that's out there on Indigenous people. And just to kind of like give you an idea, this is a dissertation by Leonard Bruyere. It's like, I think it was published in, geez, when was this published? I found this in the archives. Let me look at it, because it's actually really important, because he, talking about like white guys writing the first comprehensive histories of things. Oh yeah, this was published in 1993, right? You should all go read it, because he does this there's this accusation that's leveled against Lakota people, that we're like new arrivals and that we're imperialists, because U.S. historians can only understand like violence, genocide, and death as like like as progenitors of history or makers of history. But we, the way it was explained to me was that Lakota and Dakota people, we weren't always the dominant people in the region. Like if you look at prairie grass, right, you see probably one kind of grass. Now you see cheatgrass because it's an invasive species, but oftentimes you see, like, just one kind of tall grass. But if you look really closely, there's multiple species of grass, right? It's very diverse. It has to be very diverse. And in some areas we were the dominant, kind of very prominent, like you could see us, but then in other areas we weren't. And he makes this very beautiful case to show that tracing the linguistic nature of our language and our terminology and what we use to define geography, is that our geographical area, we stretched all the way up into the plains in Canada. into the Rocky Mountains in Canada, right? What is today Canada, all the way to North Carolina. It doesn't mean that we were the dominant group in all those areas, but we had people that had this extensive knowledge. We knew what seas, we knew what oceans were, we knew what the Great Lakes were, we knew what the Niagara Falls were. We knew that, we knew the Americans were coming before they even came, but then also we weren't just like confined to one area. That we had these very vast and intricate migration routes. And this is in 1993. He's writing this. At the same time, you have somebody like Richard White, who's a white historian, who said that the Lakota people never crossed the Missouri River until 1776. I still have yet to find where he got that information from. I still don't understand. Like, I think it's just like a way to show, like, oh, look, 1776 Declaration of Independence. You finally, didn't live in a small little geographic area and like, finally figured out how to cross a river. It's actually really insulting to kind of like human intelligence, like that we couldn't figure out how to cross a river, and we just discovered we're late arrivals, just like the Americans were. But this is just one example. This entire dissertation, one example of the millions of pages that have been written by Lakota people and Dakota people on our own history. And if you want to check out more, we're doing a Native Reads campaign with our podcast, the Red Nation podcast. We're partnering with the Oak Lake Writer Society. There's 10 books. We just did a book on an interview with Joseph Marshall on the Lakota Way. You can check that out. This next week we have Water Lily, which is Vine Deloria's aunt, actually. Ella Deloria, she doesn't get as much attention as he does, but she wrote this fictional novel called Water Lily that's about kinship roles and kind of like the history of the Dakota people. But that's really our tradition. It's a very beautiful tradition. That's what we're trying to do. We're not like waiting for somebody to write this history for us. It's already been written, and we have our own intellectual tradition. And if you want to like check it out and like just they're really like kind of like easygoing interviews. They're not like super intense. Like most of the interviews I do like with on that podcast are like left. It's like U.S. imperialism. Oh, this one's like this one's more like what is this writing tradition? So it's a little bit more relaxed. It's for the normie crowd. Like it's cool. Well.
I know we're past on time, but I really wanted to ask you about Frederick Jackson Turner and the Frontier Thesis. So, are you willing to do this again?
On Frederick Jackson Turner and the Frontier Thesis?
Yeah.
Yeah, we should. There's a good book by like Walter Prescott Webb called The Great Frontier, and like the whole canon of Western history. And I'm not talking like Big West, like Europe. I'm talking like this idea, this like kitsch kind of like niche history of like Western history, like what counts as like the Western frontier arose out of Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis. So we should, definitely do an episode.
If you're willing to do this again, we can talk about Frederick Jackson Turner.
Give me some weeks.
Okay, some weeks. Frederick Jackson Turner, Walt Whitman, and the Western.
Okay, so Frederick Jackson Turner. Yeah, I could do that.
All right.
I have a whole lecture prepared on Western movies and the genre of Western movies, so be prepared.
Yeah. All right, cool. I'll check in a few weeks.
Cool. Thank you all for tuning in.
All right, thanks, Kenny.
Take care.